Transportation Committee meeting for April 28th, 2021. The purpose of the committee meetings are for the city departments to pass along information to the city council and discuss initiatives listed on the published agenda. By ordinance, the committee consists of the mayor, members of the city council, and the city administrator. The ordinance mandates the city administrator as chair of the committee meetings. This is a public meeting, but not a public hearing. Therefore, the meeting is open to the public. We do not take public comments or questions during the committee meetings. Public comments or questions are received at the regular city council meetings held at 7 p.m. in the city council chambers on the second and fourth Monday of each month. The first item on today's agenda is the approval of the minutes for the Community Development and Transportation Committee meeting for March 24th, 2021. Is there a motion?
Motion to approve.
Motion approved by Councilmember Judy. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Councilmember Tizer. Any questions or comments on the minutes? All in favor, please raise your hands. It's unanimous. Thank you. Moving on to community development, item number 2, consideration of an initiation for a text amendment, the Unified Development Code to sections 2.2.2, lot 2.2.8, building setbacks 2.2.9, build to zones, and 14.2 defined terms. Ms. Bromberg.
Thank you and good morning. Just as a quick point of clarification on a couple of things, in the packet that you received, we've been having some issues with Minute Track, and so page 4 of the actual ordinance, it changed some of the way it appeared. So what's in the presentation, which was also included in your packet, is correct. We're not sure what happened because the Word file is correct, but when it converted, it decided to delete some text. So just wanted to point that out as a point of clarification in case anybody noticed there were some differences. We'll make sure that that is correct in the packet the next time this is seen in front of you guys. So what we've got in front of you today is a couple of modifications. This is not a change to any of the actual definitions. It's a consolidation of putting all the definitions into the same location. There are a few definitions that show up in Article 14. Those terms may or may not exactly be the same way that they're used elsewhere in the document. For example, we refer to lot line in the definition, but then we refer to it as a property line in most other places, or as a primary street setback, etc. So all we've done is put those all into the same location so that those definitions and those terms that are used together and those alternates that might be used, for example, lot versus property, are all in one location as opposed to scattered throughout the document to hopefully make it a little bit more clear to those who read the document. So the first thing is under 2.2 lot defined is to actually add to the end of it, also referred to as property within this document because of the fact that we refer to it as a property line in some cases. Under the same definition, 2.2 lot, we are looking to change a couple of things. So E, lot frontage. The item that you see highlighted in pink, except rear-loaded townhouses are allowed to count alley right-of-way as lot frontage. That was actually deleted by council a couple of years ago and is being codified or just been codified. So the online version has still had that because it hadn't yet been codified. It was done through another text amendment a couple of years ago. That has since been codified, so I just want to show that's already been removed, just as a point of clarification, so that as you're looking through various versions of the document, that's why that is no longer included, just as a bit of transparency. We want to add to the end of that a lot that's abutting upon 2 or more streets is a corner lot. This is the definition that's in Article 14. We're just moving it forward here to this location. And then for the next 2, adding F and G, front property line and rear property line, just to be very specific that a property line or parcel line coincident with the public or private primary street right-of-way, or in the case of the cottage court, that courtyard as defined in that section of the code would be your front property line, and then rear property line would be that is opposite of the front. And if there are 2 or more streets, a corner lot, for example, then the zoning director can determine which of those property lines would actually be defined as the front. Usually if it's a new subdivision, there's orientation for us to be able to align it. It makes sense for one or the other to be the front based on the adjacent property. For building setbacks, just again to be consistent, we wanted to have a definition for it at the beginning. And this is the line demarcating the required distance between a property line and the face of a building structure or accessory structure. So again, just to add that for the same consistency and format here at this section 2.28, and there's no other change to this. I apologize, there is. I'm thinking of the next one. So this is to, there's a couple of additions we'll make on the next slide. We have moved, I just mentioned to you a minute ago, we had property line front and property line rear. the definition and how it was explained had actually been put into the building setback section as opposed to in the definition of lot. So all we did was take those definitions I just read to you exactly from here and move them to the lot definition so that that was there together. We also making a minor correction. It refers to a landscape buffer. Everywhere else in the document, that is called a neighborhood compatibility buffer, and we wanted to make sure that that was aligned properly. So we just went ahead and caught that at this point. And then the letter C, uses allowed in the build-to zone. The way that it reads today, you can't park in your driveway in a townhome. So we felt that that might be something we'd want to fix, because the way it reads right now is that with the exception of parking spaces, you can do these other uses within the build-to zone. So we do have build-to zone on townhomes in those different districts that it is allowed. And so if you have a front-loaded townhome, the way that this was written, you're not allowed to park in your driveway. So we felt that that might be something we want to just clarify, that all structures and uses that are allowed within that build-to zone, and that the parking spaces would come out of it. Now, there are some other requirements, for example, the width of driveways, the fact that it has to be a driveway to park on, and that front setback is covered elsewhere in the UDC. So this doesn't change anything, but it just is something that we realized in the way that the wording was done was something that needed to be corrected. We also just clarified with vehicle drive-through lanes, we wanted to make sure that the word facilities, it was clear that that also was referring to drive-through facilities, not being permitted in the build-to zone. So no change there, just a clarification. And then as I mentioned, these are the 5 terms within the defined terms that we are recommending to be removed. They're actually brought forward into the other sections that I just read to you. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Floor's open.
I've got a question for you about the driveways, because there's just been a development being built next door to me, and their driveways are not long enough to park a vehicle on them.
Correct.
So we're going to open it up to park vehicles, but vehicles don't fit.
Correct. So there are, and that is something that we can take a look at. There are 2 different versions for townhomes in the development that you're referring to. That would allow parking in the driveway and not allow parking in the driveway. It has to be a minimum of 20 feet to be able to allow parking in the driveway. If it's not 20 feet, it has to be 4 feet so that a car can't actually fit in there. In that particular case, I don't remember the specifics on it, but I'm pretty sure that they're not 20. I know that for a fact. I don't know what the actual dimension is. I have to go and check that with the way that it was done. But that's the difference between those, is that they have to be the 4 or the 20. Because we don't want exactly that, someone to park and then overhang into the sidewalk, et cetera.
Okay, well, here's my question. These folks don't know. They're parking their cars in these driveways that are hanging out into the street. It blocks the sidewalk. They can't fit the cars. They know that. So they're just trying to make it work because parking is limited, and there are only a certain number of spaces for them. There are a certain number of spaces for visitors, and they're just trying to make it work. So these folks that are parking, and I'm talking smaller cars don't fit.
Sure.
It's not a Tahoe or they're smaller cars that don't fit. So, and they're not going to come to the city and say, am I allowed to park my car there? They're just going to try to make it work. And their garages, they're not parking their cars in their garages. That's their prerogative. But so how do we deal with that? I mean, are there requirements that say going forward? Because I know years ago in our old code, we required that there was I can't remember the feet, but there was a number of feet between the garage door and the sidewalk. And now apparently we don't do that anymore.
We do still do that. That code has not changed. For garages, there is a definition for the fact that it must be either 20 feet or 4 feet. Again, I'd have to go pull up the 110 Woodstock plans to remember the exact dimensions that were provided in there. I do know that the majority of the sidewalks were actually being provided on the other side of the building, and I don't know that they were provided along the street. And I'd have to go double check that and just look and see that one specifically. But the way the code is written today and has been since I've been here is that the garages must be the 4 or the 20 from the the property line or the street, what's concurrent with the right-of-way line, so that you don't have that situation. From an enforcement perspective, I could take a look and see at how the enforcement side of the code is written in order for us to be able to do any enforcement within there. And I'd also have to check with the police department too, just to see like if they're in the road, if they're blocking the road, that sort of thing, and see how that fits together to make sure that there's an enforcement capability there. I know those streets in there, I believe, are private, and I don't know how much that changes that enforcement side of it, so I would just need to get some information to be able to better answer that. But I do know the code as far as the distance from the behind the sidewalk to the garage door is still the 4 or the 20. It's not a range, it has to be 4 or 20 or more. Of course, you could do more if that were necessary.
Okay, and I won't belabor this point, but I don't think the answer is enforcement. I think the answer is in the code. And people are going to be creative, and we're not going to know we've got a problem until a fire truck goes through there or needs to go through there and can't get through there because people are parking. There isn't enough parking for them. So with townhouses, I firmly believe that the code needs to answer the problem, because enforcement, that's not, to me, that's not what our code enforcement officers or our police officers should be doing. We should get it right in the code and require it, not say later, oh, well, yeah, we did this, but you can't do this and you can't do this.
Absolutely. And we will be doing that as a part of the overhaul that we've got planned for the next fiscal year. So that's something that we could be taking a look at to see, are our parking requirements not correct? Do we need to make some adjustments to that? Best of my knowledge, the plan that was there did meet the requirements for the amount of parking for the townhomes plus the guest parking. I know with stuff still being under construction, that may be complicating things, and the construction workers may be taking up some of that space in that particular situation. But that could be something that we take a look at is, are those dimensions, is the 4 and 20 still correct for what we need to have? Is that still industry standard? It is, as far as I'm aware. And then are our parking requirements as far as guest parking, et cetera? When someone chooses to fill up their garage and not park in it, I'm not sure what we can do about that. To add a lot of additional parking to compensate for that, I'm not sure is the right direction to go, but we can take a look and see what everybody else is doing and what the industry standard says that we should be doing when it comes to those sorts of elements.
And I'm not asking you to add a lot of asphalt. What I'm asking you is to have driveways at least the length of a car, because people are going to park in them. They see that as their personal space, and they can do whatever they want to in them. So, if 2 years down the road is the right time to fix this, albeit, but I think that when we recognize issues, and I don't know how many townhouses there are in the mix right now, but I think that we need to deal with this, not 2 years down the road, but now. And the other question I've got is, this came up because the garage doors on the rear of units were being considered visible or frontage. I'm not sure. So help me understand how this has corrected that situation.
That has already been corrected. As I mentioned earlier, the statement, except rear-loaded townhomes are allowed to count alley right-of-way as frontage, is gone. It has been out of the code for a couple of years. I say a couple of years. It's been over a year, maybe 18 months. And so today, a townhome rear-loaded would have a road in the front and a road in the back. If it's a front-loaded townhome, it has to have the front, of course, the road on the front, and the rear can be whatever else it might be. So that has actually already been addressed, and so no new developments that come in for a zoning application, or if it's something that is allowed by right, would come in for a site plan, would not be allowed to do that today. So this does not change that. It already has been changed.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Farmer. So I think the mayor just brought up some great points that I wasn't even aware of. First off, my position, even before learning this new issue that we have within the code, is that some of this seems pretty straightforward. Some of it, I think, is going to need more just public discussion to make sure that we're not potentially creating any loopholes and really any unintended consequences. So I think there's some aspects of here I want to make sure we're really not rushing And so today I'll certainly be supporting a deferral. I think this is important. I do want to make sure we're updating this and aligning it, but I don't want to rush it. And I don't want to rush it for two reasons. First off, just to make sure that we're not accidentally creating any opportunities for loopholes. But then secondly, I want to make sure that we're addressing this section the best way possible, because I'll tell you right now, even before the mayor brought up that real life example, that is a real issue, I wanted to make sure, is there anything else that we should be addressing that will either be beneficial to residents and protecting the character and the great community of Roswell and how development's set up, as well as being completely transparent to developers on exactly what's needed, what's allowed, what isn't allowed. But with this example, this comes in. I think even just by definition, driveway, you should be able to drive on it, and if you can't fit a car on it, then I have a real concern, and that's not setting our city up for success, especially as we see more townhomes coming closer to the downtown, where, as we discussed at council, we have some parking issues we need to address. So if we're creating if our code is creating driveways that aren't even long enough to fit a car, then I think that's an issue, and I think that should be addressed now. I don't want to wait a year or two for this, and even next month or in a couple months, I don't want to finish up the first reading, second reading of this, get these updates in, only to be starting the process for other updates. So I'd really rather have it all at once. Granted, we could certainly spend, I think, a good hour or two walking through all the details and brainstorming, but given the fact that I think we have a transportation item that I think will probably take a very long time today, and of course we have a budget work session the public's certainly waiting for. My preference would be if we could have a discussion, but then just defer this to the next committee meeting to make sure that we have the time to really publicly discuss all potential impacts of all this, as well as what are some additional updates. Again, I was not aware of the driveway one. I think that's a perfect example of an update I'd want to see done with this, and really just questioning staff. Are there any other opportunities, as well as council, any other opportunities to make sure we're really doing the best we can on this? So that's what my position and my vote will be today.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Lenore, for presentation and all the great comments before. I have a question about, I think it's the definition of a building front. I understand, and how that relates to the appearance and the access, the location of a driveway, and kind of what kind of flexibility does staff have now to make sure that the way a building is situated is best suited, not only to that development, but to the surrounding area.
Sure, that's a great question. So when it comes to single-family houses and commercial buildings, et cetera, there is language not only in the International Building Code regarding entrances and facing public space versus road, et cetera. There's a variety of definitions that are in there. Within the UDC, there is a definition regarding the pedestrian access facing a road, and it was in a section that's largely referring to like commercial style buildings as opposed to a single family house. Driveway location is not necessarily defined except for if there's a garage. So if there's a garage, it's in the front, then of course the driveway's in the front. If it's in the rear, then the driveway may be in the rear. So there isn't anything that necessarily gives any definition on where that driveway shall be. It's going to be based on the way that lot is being laid out. Townhomes is a little bit different because you really only have a couple of choices, either the front or the back, unless they're doing something detached. Today, there's not a lot of flexibility because that statement was removed, as I mentioned earlier, regarding the rear-loaded townhomes. It basically now would be that if you are front-loaded, you have to be, it would be on the, if you're on a primary street, let me actually find it, I'm not sure if I have it in the PowerPoint presentation, that section regarding townhomes in Article 2. Yes. Let me just read that. Yes, this is back here. So specifically this is residential garage parking. It talks about the applicability of that and the standards for that. This is where, depending on detached and attached houses, where it refers to the garage doors being oriented toward the street, that they have to be, in this case, it's written as between 5 and 20 feet from, I don't understand this sentence, I'll have to read it again. Oh, it's for semi-flush. It's talking about whether it's flush with the face of the house or not. That doesn't matter. We won't talk about that. And there's recessed, there's side-loaded garage court, et cetera. When you get to townhouses, it specifically says that townhouses fronting a major street, which is going to be a classification provided by transportation, major versus minor, that fronting a major street, it has to be rear loaded. So what that then means is that townhome is going to be facing a major street. There'll be a minor street or an alley to the rear, and the garages would be rear loaded from that side. So you would have a street on both sides of those townhome units. And then if it is fronting a minor street, you could do either way. If it's a minor street, you can do front loaded. And the point of that would be to not have people backing in and out of their driveways onto a busier road and have those driveways be on a lower volume road. And that is pretty much the only things that are in here. We were not asked to look at driveway access as a part of this. We were only asked to look at the definitions of the lot lines themselves, frontage versus property line, et cetera. So we did not go through the entire document to find all the occurrences of that. But they generally, as I said earlier, for single-family houses, because of the way the setbacks are required on those, there doesn't tend to be any issues with those shorter driveways. It's going to generally be limited to townhomes where that 4 and 20 is being provided. This may be an opportunity where we remove the 4 and require that all driveways have to be a minimum of 20 feet so that there is that parking available in the driveway. That may have an impact on the minimum lot size. We'd have to take a look at that to see if, there's a minimum townhome size, there's those setbacks that need to be required. Does this now impact those minimum requirements or not? I don't think it will, but those are the kinds of things that we would need to take a look at, which is a lot more complex and in-depth evaluation than we were asked to do at this point.
Right.
Hopefully that answers your question. And I do know, the points that are being raised are great, and there are certainly things that we recommend taking a look at as a part of the evaluation that we're actually asking, we'll be talking about in a minute when it comes to budget, to have the UDC updated. These are the kinds of things that as changes have happened either in development or within the code itself, we want to make sure that there's someone taking a look at that entire document and finding all of these things and making sure that we address them to satisfy those concerns.
Right. Yeah, I'm just concerned about getting into a box where we're taking away flexibility, and essentially what you're going to say is that a rear-loaded townhome is not allowed, where I think in certain situations, it's a very valid use of lot. So,
Absolutely, and that flexibility has pretty much been taken away when that statement was removed with regarding the rear-loaded being able to use the alley, and that was not necessarily what the intention was. There was a misuse of that being tried by a number of people where they were not wanting to meet the standard roadway requirements for that rear-loaded. If you're rear-loaded only, and there's no road in the front, and you're facing a green space, there was an argument that because it says they can have an alley, they're now pulling the definition of alley, which is in many cases a one-way, narrow street. It may be two-way, just depending on the width that's provided, but it doesn't provide fire access. You have even worse parking conditions. And so because that was that way, that was the recommendation, was to take that out, but it does remove the flexibility of being able to have a rear-loaded townhome that faces a green space, for example, which we have done a number of those over the years because that's what the developers recommended, wanted. I'm assuming since they've sold other units, that's what the homeowners wanted as well. And today, if someone were to come in to do that, the council couldn't grant an exception to that, but that is not something that staff would be able to recommend for approval because it doesn't meet this code.
Right, okay. That just worries me about taking away some flexibility that would, really result in an optimal project for certain areas, for the entire community, not just that development, so.
Absolutely, and we would recommend reviewing that as a part of the UDC to see what kind of flexibilities this council would want to offer within the code to let those types of developments happen. Again, we weren't asked to re-examine that, so today that flexibility is already removed. The changes that are recommended here are purely to move the definitions all into one location. We weren't asked to look at any of those other things yet, but we are absolutely expecting that to happen if we get our item approved for budget.
Good, all right, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Lenore. I agree with Councilmember Palermo. I would support a deferral so that we can examine this a little bit more and maybe incorporate some of what Councilmember Wilsey is addressing as well, and Mayor Henry. Just a couple of questions. On 2.2.2, where you talk about lot, we go from E, F, and G, and we talk about lot frontage and then jump to front property line. When you talk about property line, is it different than lot? Is that the intent for the change of the language of calling it front property line instead of lot line?
No, ma'am. As a matter of fact, we added, so this is actually one of the things that created some confusion when people would come to us. Same thing with, there's a street, a road, a lane. There's a lot of different words that can be used to describe the same bit of asphalt that's going within that right of way. And it does tend to create confusion for someone who's taken that literal word and trying to apply it somewhere else. So in this particular case, that's one of the things we recommended is we have a lot, which is a subset within usually a larger development, or it may be a single lot that's already been platted out. But then when we got to some of the other definitions within the language, we started referring to it as property instead of lot. Same thing with parcel. We call it parcel in a different definition. So we wanted to make sure that here we were very clear that you're going to see it referred to a couple different ways. In the future, one of the things we may want to consider is changing them all to match. But some people don't call it's not my lot line, it's my property line. And there's surveyors who may call it that. So they're very interchangeable terms that we didn't want to preclude that from being used, but at the same time, we wanted to make sure those definitions were very clear. So with regards to that, we've added that to the definition of lot to make sure it's clear that it may be called lot line and it may also be called property line within this document. These definitions here from F and G, front property line and rear property line, were already in the UDC, and we just brought them from the next section back into here, where we're talking about the line, the lot lines and the definitions of those that are included. So those were actually not under lot, they were under building setbacks, where it defined what the rear property line is and the front property line is, so that you could know where your setback was coming from. So we go out all the way back here where we're talking about how to measure from that line, but we hadn't defined the line yet. So all we did was take those two definitions, word for word, and bring them forward to here. That helped, I hope.
A little bit. Just a follow-up question to that. And then under E, a lot abutting upon two or more streets is a corner lot. So what happens if you have a property or a lot that has a primary street on the front and then another street like an alley on the back? So that abuts two streets, so that's a corner. Now, you could potentially have a lot of corner lots that aren't
That's
actually really
a fantastic catch. What that actually should say, and I think a word got left out when we brought the definition forward, it's supposed to be two or more intersecting streets. There should be an intersection. So we will fix that. That is actually left out. I'm not sure what happened, because I thought we just copied and pasted it straight from the Article 14 up front. But it should be intersecting, because you're right. If you had a front and a back, that wouldn't be a corner. It's going to be an interior, because there's clearly something on either side of it. But it should say intersecting street.
Thank you.
That.
Thank you. So regarding section 2.2.8, point number 5, is any way you can show us an example? 2.2.8, number 5.
The picture for that. I don't think there's a picture in the UDC to go with it. Let me look at when abutting a protected district, all rear, it might be back. Oh, it may be in the landscape buffer. So what that means, Councilmember Zapata, is that if there is a required landscape buffer, and let's say it's 40 feet, for example, so there's a required landscape buffer from this use to this use, and there's the 40 feet. If the rear setback, let's say, is 20 feet for that particular zoning that they're doing, we don't allow them to do 20 feet from the property line. They have to do 20 feet from that neighborhood compatibility line. So that's what that is. So let's see if we've got a drawing that can show that for you. I don't know if it's labeled. Actually, here, it's this one. So if you look here, there you go. This is the property line back here. Oop. Do it. This is the property line here, so this would be your protected district on this side. This is the property line, this is the required neighborhood compatibility buffer, and then this distance here is the minimum setback from the rear. So this building could be this far back. What's going on? So that, this gray shaded area is defining those setbacks from the property line, but because there's a neighborhood compatibility buffer, it actually is from that compatibility buffer line, not from the rear, so that we don't eat into that and have a way for them to not do that compatibility buffer the full depth.
Before it said landscape, so it was more confusing with the word landscape.
Well, and right, so it did say landscape, but we actually refer to that in the code as a neighborhood compatibility buffer. So we're changing that. So instead of landscape, it's not just a landscape buffer, this is actually the neighborhood compatibility buffer to make sure that that buffer that's required for those zoning districts that are next to each other to be protected from that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. On item G, which is where we were on the F and G, the front and rear property lines. The question is, there is a definition on how we define front and rear, is that correct?
Yes, the front would be coincident with the right-of-way line of the public or private street, and rear is opposite of that. And so that's already included in the code today. We're just moving it to this location.
Okay, and my question is, so the authority given to the zoning director to determine the rear of the property, why would we need that if it's already defined in the
There
code?
today, and so there are some cases where we have very unusual geometry in a roadway. You may have 2 minor streets. You may have 3. You may have some random location where you've got, it's actually on 3. And so that gives the zoning director the flexibility to work with them to figure out what makes the most sense for the front to be. That's in the code today. That's not anything we're adding. That's already there today. We're just putting it here instead of in the setback discussion. But we have, for example, there's one I can tell you that it's on a corner in a residential neighborhood. So this house faces this way, this house faces this way. If they were to come in and do new development, it could be either one. The roads are equal, and so both of them are correct. But let's say that the lot is very narrow in one direction, and so we can work with them to say, all right, well, this is gonna be your front as opposed to this, so that your setbacks will work. So for example, if the setbacks are such that you turn it so that the wider part is your front, it's possible that when you apply your front and rear setbacks, you now don't have enough room to actually build a house. It's an extreme case, but that then gives the zoning director to have that flexibility to make sure that we're not directing one to be the front that would preclude them from being able to develop the property. It doesn't come up very often. It's a very rare circumstance, but that's in there today in the building setback discussion.
But it's clear, I mean, it's clear which street is the primary street.
You don't always have 2 primaries. Well, maybe there's a primary, but you could have 2. So primary just means that it's the main street. The secondary, I don't know if we even call it secondary, where it really starts talking about the different types is when you have a major versus a minor. But you can have 2 streets. For example, let's pick a new development is going in Briarstone at Nesbitt Ferry. All those internal roads, once you're in that development, are the same classification. So they're all primary in the sense that it's the only roads available for those buildings to front to. So if I'm at a corner of 2 of those streets, both of those could be the front. And so the zoning director would work with that developer to make sure that what they are recommending to do makes sense. You know, it's usually not an issue at all.
So this applies, it's more applicable inside a subdivision or inside a development?
Correct, correct,
Thank
yes.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lenore, for answering all the questions, and I think everybody's brought up a lot of good questions and a lot of good discussion. So given that, I'd like to go ahead and make a motion to defer to a future ComDev meeting, or, for further discussion, and maybe it's part of a much larger discussion, such as the UDC review that we're looking at.
Second the motion to defer.
Councilmember Wilsey makes a motion to defer, second by Councilmember Palermo.
I have a clarification question.
So do I, so please.
That was very open-ended. Are you deferring to when we do an overhaul of the UDC? Or are you deferring to next month, next week? Where are you deferring?
We can move it to the next ComDev meeting and then discuss it then, and possibly defer to a larger discussion. We'll continue this discussion.
Well, and we would like some clarification, because we have only been asked to examine the definitions regarding lot frontage and the lot lines. The other things that we've been talking about today, we don't necessarily have any direction from you guys on what you want included in that. So we would prefer to have a little bit more direction from you. Are we looking at parking? I mean, this has the potential to become a very long list, and we want to make sure that we don't leave anything out and drag it out any further than we need to from the process perspective.
Right.
So if I could get some help on that, I would appreciate it.
I think I would include, the definition of fronts and flexibility regarding, front versus rear loaded and frontage. Just a little more definition on that, and some examples of what that refers to. Driveway length, I heard. And Mike, are there some things?
So the motion to defer to the next ComDev committee meeting.
Yes.
And so
Second that motion, Councilman Palermo.
yeah, and I agree with what Councilmember Wilsey just said in the examples. What I'd probably encourage is for ComDev to get with their liaison, and the liaison can always touch base with the rest of council and come back with any other concerns that anyone has. But I agree with the items that Councilmember Wilsey brought up.
And I would like to reiterate that, yes, you were given a certain direction, and I appreciate you going in that direction. It just so happened that something in your presentation triggered driveway lengths, which I thought we had taken care of years ago. As a matter of fact, it was a development that somewhat propelled me into politics because it was a very, the developer chose to maximize the density at the expense of livability. And so in that situation, they had one-car garages, driveways that did not even meet the length of a Volkswagen, in all seriousness. You can't park a Volkswagen on these streets. And then the streets were so narrow that you can't park on the street. And it's just, everything is just so dense. And all of that was by design. And, I hate to say it, but a lot of folks, when they're looking at a new home, they're really not thinking about the practical aspects of it. So I personally, I thought all of this had been taken care of until, the development next door to me. So you came into this, and I thank you, to look at garages and that they shouldn't be the primary facade. So I appreciate that, but then it does lead to the issue of driveways, and I'm not proposing that we add a lot more parking to townhomes or single-family complexes. But if you've got a driveway that's not long enough to park a car in, there's an issue there. So, and I think we need to take care of the issue. I don't think it's an enforcement issue. I think it's a code issue. So I'll support the motion.
Any other questions from the council? Moving on to item number 3, consideration of the initiation of a text amendment to the Unified Development Code to Section 12.2, stream buffers, Section 12.2.3, land development. Now,
Here to present a text amendment to section, excuse me, 12.2, which is the stream buffer ordinance, and we are requesting revisions to the variance process. This ordinance passed in December 2020. If you recall, the Metro District passed their own model ordinance. We had to align our ordinance with theirs, and they had a variance process there that we would like to make a revision to. Our previous ordinance had the ability to do an administrative variance when an applicant came in and had a disturbance in an undisturbed buffer. To a small degree, we had some ability to allow that disturbance because it was the one that fit with the property, and to expand the buffer in another area. Or we have other ways to mitigate disturbances which will both meet the intent of the code, which is to protect the stream, and to allow the property owner to do the project that they would like to do. So the new ordinance it's written. It was written that all variances need to go to the Board of Zoning Appeal. We recognized this when we brought this to you originally. When I reached out to the Metro District at that time, they didn't have any communities who had been using this yet, so there was and they didn't have any guidance for me as far as an administrative variance process. But over the new year, since then, that was about 6 months period of time there, there's several communities that are using this now. So I reached out to them and to EPD and to the Metro District to understand how folks are doing this. So that's why we're bringing this to you today. So the new ordinance has two ways to do a stream buffer variance. There is with mitigation and without mitigation. And mitigation is there are practices which will reduce the impact to either the undisturbed buffer or reduce the impact to the no impervious setback. We can talk about some of those mitigation practices if you'd like at the end. And then if the engineering manager and the applicant can't come up with a way to make that work on that property, then the applicant can go to the Board of Zoning Appeals and ask for the intrusion into the buffer without mitigation. And that's all in the ordinance. So we would like to have the ability to do an administrative variance. These are small intrusions and small disturbances by and large, and we feel like it would be more efficient and better for the applicant, for our residents to be able to work out these details in the land disturbance process rather than taking every application to the Board of Zoning Appeals. It'll eat up their time when they could be looking at more important things. So, as far as what types of mitigation we would consider when we're looking at intrusions into the undisturbed buffer and into the no impervious setback, I can give you an example of a pool that went to BZA last month, and went to BZA and the kinds of things, what they brought to us to begin with and what we brought to BZA. So they had a pool. The pool was in the 100-foot no disturbance buffer and in the additional 50-foot no impervious buffer. It had a wide pool deck around the pool. And we talked them through it, and they did a couple of things. The first thing that they did was they pulled the pool toward the house so that it was not in the 100-foot no disturbance buffer at all. For the large pool that was now in the no impervious buffer, they removed the pool deck. And so it was just the coping around the pool, and then it will be grass up to the edge of the pool. And the third thing that they did was, because now their pool was less than the 1,000 square feet of impervious area required for water quality treatment. We still asked them to do water quality treatment. So they ended up picking up a roof drain and putting it in a flow well, so that will mitigate the impervious effect of the pool, because it will allow that water to infiltrate from the roof that was before not going over that area. So now it'll go into the flow well and infiltrate into the ground from there. So those are the kinds of things that that from an administrative variance process, we would like to be able to do to streamline the process for our residents. I'm happy to answer questions.
Councilmember Zapata.
Thank you. So, yeah, I'm all to facilitate the process, but also I'm for give the public, the residents, taxpayers, and people of Roswell the chance to, express support or opposition to something like that. So I think that through the Board of Zoning Appeals, they might have a chance to express and get notified and know about what's going on. I'm not talking about a little pool on the backyard. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the big developments, that they might carry some issues about that. So if it goes straight to the engineering director, how much public input will be on the process?
Well, for a small thing, like a pool or a deck, we have a lot of properties that have a creek behind them, and the house is up against the no disturbance buffer. So it's 100 feet from the creek, and there's a 100-foot buffer. So if they want to put a deck on in their backyard, on the back of their house, then they right now need to go through this lengthy public process. And we feel that is not the best use of BZA's time, because putting a deck on the back of your house seems like a reasonable thing to do, and as long as as long as the ordinance, the intent of the ordinance can still be met. Now, if this is a bigger issue, it will still have to go to BZA. So I wouldn't, also, there's a state buffer within that 50 or 100-foot no impervious buffer. There's a 25-foot state buffer that we cannot waive. So folks cannot do anything in there. So a large intrusion into the buffer, that would still have to go to BZA, because my task is to make sure that the intent of the ordinance is met. And if the intent of the ordinance from what the developer or the homeowner provides to me, then BZA would have to make that decision. Does that help?
And just to clarify as well, Councilmember Zapata, those larger developments likely have another step in the process before they get to land disturbance permit. For example, they may have a plat, they have to do a preliminary plat, they may be coming to you, they may be going to design review board, et cetera. So those larger projects tend to have steps earlier in the process when Danelle and her staff are actually addressing these types of buffer encroachments then. So the old way the code was written is the way that this is actually more clearly codifying in the request that Danelle is making to you today. That same process of going through a mitigation discussion about buffer averaging, what can you do to compensate for any impacts you might have in the city buffers, was all done very early in the process, whether it was a preliminary plat for a new subdivision, if it was something that was coming to council for some sort of zoning change, et cetera. So that public portion absolutely is still included in those projects, and that requirement of showing any impacts to those buffers, we required it at that stage, so way before they get to land disturbance. So the types of projects that are going to come through under this scenario here are going to be your smaller lot who's trying to put a pool in, and if they do, like the example that Danelle provided to you, it makes sense for that to be something that can be approved at the staff level. But if it's someone who refuses to make those kinds of changes, then we do believe it should go to the public. It should be BZA who's having those comments, because the best interest of those buffers isn't necessarily being met through the negotiation part of the mitigation. So hopefully that helps clarify that it's more than just this process that those would go through.
Oh, yeah, great, thanks but it's not a way to quantify small, because I understand if it's small, why to go through a very tedious process. So is any way to quantify what is small and what is big, or it's very hard to quantify to make it clear, you know, if you are whatever, 2 yards is small, if you are more than 2 yards, I mean, I don't know. There's a way to quantify or not?
Well, the ordinance applies to parcels that were platted previously or at the time of the adoption, so it doesn't apply to new development. So this would not be a way for a developer to go in and take all the buffers out without following all the other processes. So with a new buffer or with a new subdivisions, they have to abide by it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to follow up on Councilmember Zapata's question, what determines, I understand that the larger projects have many other steps, but what determines what falls under the administrative exception and what determines what has to go to BZA, other than noncompliance by an applicant?
It's because every single project is different. I don't know that there's a particular answer. We would not, I wouldn't allow somebody to put or I wouldn't support, let me say, I wouldn't support someone removing half of their buffer to put a pool. Now, you know, all of these decisions have to be, in my opinion, my goal is for residents to be able to use their property in a way that they want, doesn't hurt their neighbor, doesn't hurt the environment, doesn't hurt a future property owner. So it always does have to be weighed. You know, the no setback, the impervious setback portion is, I feel like there is a lot of flexibility that folks can have in that because there's some concrete ways to mitigate that. And there are some concrete ways to mitigate the buffer as well. Let's say it's a 50-foot buffer and folks want to get 10 feet into the 50-foot buffer and they want to take out, or they want to put a pool in that 50-foot undisturbed buffer, or in the first 10 feet of the 50-foot undisturbed buffer. Oftentimes, another way that we can mitigate that is to require the rest of the buffer to be heavily improved, because a lot of times buffers are grass. They are lawn that folks mow down to the edge of the creek. And so what we can say is, yes, you can do this pool, but you're going to have to put shrubs, and you're going to have to put shrubs and trees and a landscape plan that makes the rest of your buffer really good. And in my opinion, that's more protective of what we have out there right now, which is just grass. And so having the ability to look at each process, or to look at each property and use the resources that we have from the state and from EPD and from Metro District will, I feel like, give us the most protective and the best outcome for the property owner.
Just to follow up, so you're doing this right now, and making your recommendations, and then it goes to the BZA in all these cases.
Yes.
And we're just trying to, by doing this, some of these are going to go to the BZA and some aren't.
Right. Anything larger, I could give you an example of one that would have to go to BZA well, I can give you an example of one that would have to go to BZA. There's a lot of subdivisions that were platted prior to this ordinance and prior to the previous version of this ordinance, which was in about 2000. And so, the Martin's Landing, those older subdivisions before 2000, they might have a lot. And in fact, there's one on Holcomb Bridge Road that had come through before this, off of Holcomb Bridge Road. And it was platted maybe in the 70s, and there's a buffer, and it takes it takes the whole lot out, so the lot is unbuildable, but it's a platted lot. Has a creek in the back, had a 25-foot state buffer, now we've done this, now this 100-foot and 150-foot buffer applies. I don't think the intent of the ordinance is to not allow parcels, legitimate legal parcels to be built on, but they can't do anything that will meet the ordinance. So I would have to, so that would have to go to BZA, and BZA would have to make a decision on that, because there isn't anything I can do to mitigate a house going in the middle of the undisturbed buffer and in the middle of the no impervious buffer. It's just too much disturbance. So that's, so it's an example of one that I would personally, I think that lot should be able to be built on, so I wouldn't oppose it in that way, but it doesn't meet the ordinance, so it would still have to go to them.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the thorough way you've presented this. I like the fact that you've created a balance between what a resident of our city would want to do at their home and the protection of rivers, creeks, and streams. And I think that the professionals that you all are giving you the ability to help make these things better and to negotiate our way through them with a resident, making it a more pleasurable experience for them to deal with their city government is important. And so, with that, I support the change. And unless there's more discussion, we've got a lot of things on our agenda today. I'd be happy to make a motion to accept this.
So I definitely have a lot more discussion. I've been raising my hand for a while.
Let me record this, hold on. Motion on the floor to initiate the text amendment.
Yeah, if he wants to make his comments, that's fine with me.
Yeah, so I have a number of questions because without a doubt, I love the intent that you have by bringing the update. I love the idea of balance. I certainly fully support and want to make sure it's easy for anyone to build a deck or build a pool. So those are things I support. My concern is that this potentially opens the door for many other things, and that's where my concern is. Where did we do an injustice to residents where we didn't? Right now, you gave the example, someone with the pool is getting approved, so we're not preventing them. It's just the goal is how can we make it easier, which is the right goal. But at the same time, I think what this council needs to really understand, and I even have some questions where I don't know the answers to them, that I need to understand through this, because keep in mind, for me, there's no question, Danelle, that you are going to do the right thing to have that right balance to protect the environment, to protect the neighbors of the properties and all that stuff. There's no question in that. My concern is anytime we're changing an ordinance, a lot of these can stay on there for a long time. So I want to be thinking, three engineers, ahead. And so I guess one question that I had is, so you're saying one of the protections that this has is the fact that it's only things that were platted a while ago. So I'll use an example. I think it was recently on the DRB agenda. I think I saw it, 1223 Canton Street. So did that one need to be replatted, or is that remaining the same plat? Because it's staying the same property lines, but obviously a different use and different approval. So how does that work?
So the 1223 Canton Street was approved by the mayor and council back in 19 for their conditional use, and they are in process to go through the conditional use process, or the DRB process. But as you must have noticed, yes, they are going to the BZA as well, not for a stream buffer or anything related to that, but they are using the same lot lines. Nothing has changed in that project.
And so that's an exact example that I think this is opening the door as a major risk in the future is. So what you've described, you used examples that were just really small examples that are fantastic, and I love the idea of making easier. The challenge is that's not all this is going to do. This is going to create the opportunity where even if it's a large multifamily development, as long as they're keeping their same plat, then there's the potential this is done in a not public setting, No, so, no, here's, let me walk through the example. Let's pretend you've got a development that's going on, they're keeping their same lot lines, so they're not getting a new plat, and they have a stream on the property, and they didn't need a request, a variance or anything like that ahead of time, but in the future, some change occurs where they now do want to request a change to the stream buffer, in which case, it's my understanding, they'd already have an approved conditional use, they'd already have all this stuff approved. If they had something where they needed a stream buffer, wouldn't they need to just come and request a variance that would today go to BZA? So I guess help me understand how that would not get, because I think there's just a lot of examples that need to go through before we potentially open the door for a lot of risks in the future.
Again, this is not a new process. This is the way that we've been operating. I've been here since 2008, I think since 2000. Trying to have the ability to make small changes in the buffers.
But there's nothing in here that says it has to be just small changes.
Well, I can read it, and it may make it a little bit more clear if that would help.
That'd be great.
Point out that there are state requirements that we follow for the mitigation and those impacts and how those can be done, because in many cases there's also a state buffer that's nearby. And so the documents and the tools that we have in place are actually state documents that have written guidance that are utilized by staff in applying those same principles to the city buffers, since they're just an extension of that state buffer. Just to point that out while she was getting ready to read
Yeah,
that.
and as you read it too, because again, my thought process is our current staff is doing a great job. I just want to make sure the ordinance we're doing is for the future. I'm concerned, is it possible, is there anything in here where a future engineering director could have a different definition of sufficient mitigation than you have? Because I think you illustrated what a perfect job you did with the pool example, where it sounds like extremely sufficient and fully offsets the effects, which is fantastic. But would this allow for a future engineering director to not have the same level of mitigation? And then again, too, and I'm looking forward to your reading, because I haven't heard anything that says it's impossible for a future engineering director to have this include larger developments as well, because the only thing I'm seeing in here is if it's replatted. So if it's replatted, it's protected. But if it's not replatted is where I see this as a potential risk far down the line. And of course, that's when residents start to notice, et cetera.
I think the first line of the ordinance, where it says, where a parcel was platted prior to the effective date of the ordinance, its shape, topography, or other physical condition prevents land development consistent with the ordinance, and the engineering director otherwise finds that lawful use of the property would not be able to be used, then these kinds of mitigation measures can be considered.
But that was all subjective. So if we use the 1223 example, there are a number of neighbors near there where currently, if this does not pass, it's the Board of Zoning Appeals that it's seen in front of, and you'll give a recommendation. So let's just say they do an incredible job, they fully offset it, and your recommendation is that the variance should be granted. And then there'll be a public process where the neighbors there can see all the great mitigation that you've done. My concern is what this is saying is if they had, and I'm just using if they had a stream, I'm just giving that clearly. That's not just a house putting in an old house putting in a pool or a deck. This is going to create the opportunity where residents are going to lose the public process, where they're going to see this large new building. And then after the fact, got some type of variance for something additional, which is then therefore, potentially impacting neighbors. And it was never done publicly, so they're gonna have to do ORRs to find out what was the process. Will the mitigation be clear? And I just feel we're making it a little more difficult. So what I'd prefer to see is just if we could somehow objectively define what makes it a small project, existing structure, things like that. Because again, I do want to make it easier for any homeowner that wants to add on a deck or a pool, but I just don't want to risk that this could actually be used, further down the line for larger developments that should have a lot more public process.
Just a quick point of clarification. The intent and the way, if you read the entire ordinance, this is just one section of it, is that thou shalt not get in the buffer is step number 1. And if there is any way to develop a lot without getting in the buffer, that is going to be what is required of them. This is going to only apply to situations where you have an existing site that there are constraints on it that this places on top of our zoning setbacks, et cetera, that make the property not buildable. For example, with the pool wouldn't be allowed if they didn't have room to move it out. It's an example of the buffer being immediately behind the house. The only way to put a pool in, it has to be in the buffer. And so that is this is meant for those types of situations. This is not for new subdivisions. This is not for, and to add on to that, all of the subdivisions, with the exception of some of the much older ones, which are where this is going to really come into effect, the buffer ordinance, as Danelle mentioned, has been in effect since 2000. So any development that came in the past 21 years already complies with those buffers, and any variance that may have been provided from a negotiation mitigation perspective has been documented on those plats. So this is then intended for those older developments, those things where there isn't that option that we've already been through, and in most cases, those are all going to come through in that first step in the process, that it does have some public element to it, whether it's going to DRB, whether, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to come to this board. So just to be clear on this, is that this is intended to help with those existing developments that were in existence before we had a buffer ordinance. The new
But
ordinance
then we should write that. So, because that's the intent, but my concern is 30 years from now, we might have a completely, different group of individuals. And you and I know this intent, but in 30 years, likely, you and I will not be paying attention to all the different requests that come through. And again, you're not even going to see the requests come through because there wouldn't have been a BZA meeting. It would have just been done through staff. And so that's where, if this actually said, this is for older structures that want a swimming pool, I support it today. If this is saying for, a fence, I support it today. My concern is, what's not clear to me is, are there any other possibilities? Because right now, the only thing it's saying is it can't be something that has a new plat. But again, we've just discussed, you can have some very large developments that don't get new plats. So that's where it's just not completely clear to me.
And those would be required to comply with the buffer ordinance in its entirety. They wouldn't have this ability for a variance. So this is only, and maybe we deliberately didn't give you the whole 30-page ordinance because this was only one section, but I think that may be where we've got some confusion, is that the basis of the ordinance is that all these buffers apply depending on the stream type, period, end of story. That did not exist before. That's a change in the model ordinance. And before, if it was platted on or before a certain date, which was in 2000, the 25-foot state buffer was the only buffer that applied, and the city didn't get to have buffers. That's actually, we've expanded the buffer requirement with this new model ordinance. And so now we've got, for example, Martin's Landing, we may have a house that before only was required to comply with 25-foot buffer, and today would have the additional 50 or 100, depending on what the size of the stream is. This then provides them an avenue to be able to impact that buffer if they can't avoid it, to be able to move forward with a project they may want to. So just to be, this is a subset of a larger document, and that document starts with, these buffers apply regardless of when a development came in. It doesn't matter if it's 50 years old, 100 years old, or today, the buffers apply. And then in a situation where we've got these plats that are older, and a homeowner's coming in and they have topography issues, they have reasons and constraints on their parcel where they can't build without impacting the buffer, this gives them an avenue to be able to gain approval either through a staff level or through BZA.
So I guess let's use help walk me through, because again, I agree with that. I share that intent. I want to make it easier for someone in Martin's Landing to do that. So let's use the example, someone in Martin's Landing, it's an older plat, and somehow under, you know, hypothetical, a 1223 Cannon Street, which is gonna be a large building on a small property, and it's not gonna be replatted, that's gonna be built, it's gonna be built without any buffers because they didn't, let's just assume, or any variances, let's assume they requested no variances. They build their new large building, and then afterwards, they decide we really wanna add on to it, by doing whatever to it. It never got a new plat, so I'm thinking that new large building, help me understand, is it possible for a engineering director to ever do it without going to the Board of Zoning Appeals? Help me understand how that.
I
that's
don't
prevented.
believe so. I think, you know, what, if someone were to come in today and stay out of the buffers and go according to plan, and then come in, they create a situation for themselves where they're forced to do buffer impacts if we say no. That is something that would have to go to BZA. We're not gonna let them expand into the buffer just so they can have more square footage without some compensation for it, and that's not possible. I mean, the 1223 example is a very filled lot, like it's, you know, maxed out, correct? And so that's not something where if there were a stream going through the middle of that, they would not be allowed to impact. Their design would have to stay out of the buffer.
Is there anything that objectively restricts that, or are you just saying you wouldn't allow it because you two feel that doesn't go with the intent?
No, I believe the code actually
The
says
last
that.
sentence says variances will not be considered when, following the adoption of the ordinance, actions of the property owner of a given property have created a hardship on that property.
Okay, so you'd be
if they
saying
have
them
done
building the
that-
big building would be creating the hardship? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, if they have done that, and then they've asked for a second one,
Right, so those protections were in place before, they were in place with the new model ordinance, but enhanced because before there, like we talked about when we passed this before, there wasn't a defined variance process and there wasn't defined enforcement process either. And so the code today basically expanded that, but also gave us more buffers. It provided us opportunities to have more buffer that we didn't before.
Now,
And so I think that the concerns that you're raising are absolutely addressed in the entirety of the ordinance.
What about, instead of it being a pool, what if it was a garage? Would this still be relevant if it was a homeowner putting in a garage? Because I think you all have probably heard from, and Danelle, I know you have, there's a neighborhood that behind them has a garage being built that's as large or larger than the houses built 10 feet from the property line. Would, if that was, and obviously 10 feet from the property line wouldn't be realistic, but something like that, would a garage be able to be used through this where it does not go to the BZA and goes through the engineering director?
if the garage was not in the, we wouldn't allow them to I wouldn't allow them to put a garage wholly in the undisturbed buffer. So the undisturbed buffer is an undisturbed buffer. It should not be if you read the intent, if you read the ordinance about the undisturbed buffer, that has to be undisturbed. So no, a garage, and just on that one, 1050 Lancaster Square, it's a house. They bought a large parcel behind them, subdivided it, and added that parcel, or in land to several of the properties on his neighbors. And so he's got about 4 acres. He does have a big garage. I think he's 40 feet away at a minimum from the property lines.
Well, and just to clarify to your answer to your question, Councilmember Palermo, the same principles would apply. You're required to be out of the buffer. If there's no way for you to be able to do something that's allowed otherwise by code within the buffer, then this is the process that it would go through. There are very strict requirements when it comes to the mitigation, when it comes to the undisturbed buffer. The undisturbed buffer is one of those, the way the ordinance is written, there's very little flexibility if there's not a way for them to mitigate it. The undisturbed buffer is one of those that would, by and large, end up at BZA because that's going to be the one that we want the most protections to. The no impervious, you're allowed to build in, but there are limitations and restrictions to that. And so that's where there's flexibility and mitigation and things that could be done in order to put something within that, because it's that kind of other layer on the buffer. So the protections and the way that the definitions are given to what's allowed within each of those, I think, is very clear within the overall ordinance today, and that's not anything that we're making any modifications to. But it doesn't matter what they're wanting to build, the same principles are still going to apply, is stay out of it, and if you can't what are ways that we can minimize that impact? And if there's not a way that we can satisfactorily minimize that impact using those tools that I mentioned before that EPD and the state have put out for us, then that has to go to BZA because they haven't complied with those other steps in the process that would be expected of them working within the buffer.
Thank you. Yeah, my final comment is, again, a reminder of my thought process. I have confidence in all of you. I want to just make sure if we're updating language that it's not purely based on the confidence within you, but just that we're making it as objective as possible so it's completely clear to predecessors 20, 30 years down the road.
Completely agree.
Thank you. So, I sense here from some of my colleagues that, we want to eliminate subjectivity and we want to quantify as much as possible what can be approved directly from the engineering director without names. Engineering director position, without any names in there, just because this, at the end of the day, will make easier the job of the engineering director. So I sense that, having some subjectivity of approval, if it's an Olympic pool, it's a hot tub, it's a garage, it's whatever it is. So I think that if we can eliminate the subjectivity from the engineering director and just give a clear lines what could be approved and what need to be moved to the Board of Zoning Appeals, I think will be much easier for everybody to make a decision today. So another ways to resolve this is what is the mechanism to appeal, not only by the applicant, the decision of the engineering director, but also appeal any neighbors or nearby. So, if it's a clear mechanism to appeal the decision, the personal decision of the engineering director, then that might be more comfortable maybe for some of my colleagues, but otherwise it will be hard to support this today.
There's an administrative appeal process that the applicant can go to BZA. They can also go through a judicial review process through Fulton County Superior Court. So there are additional appeals that the applicant has, which I think
Okay.
they have in
Great.
most ordinances.
Great. You refer to the applicant. I'm saying for nearby neighbors who see, hey, wait a minute, an Olympic pool there doesn't make sense. I need to appeal this to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So what is the mechanism, not for the applicant, it's, herself or himself, but also for anybody nearby who see that, wait a minute, the decision from the engineering director, again, without names, engineering director, doesn't make sense. How can someone else appeal other than the applicant? You just mentioned clearly the appeal process.
Councilmember Zapata, that's already covered in the general ordinance regarding variance. Any aggrieved person, that is a person with an injury, can appeal a decision of the zoning director if it's an administrative appeal. If it goes to the Board of Zoning Appeals, any aggrieved person, somebody with an injury, as a result of the decision, can appeal to the Superior Court of Fulton County. That's been the ordinance and the law since at least 1988 in Roswell.
Mr. Halsey, thank you for that clarification. At this point, since this is initiation, if you all choose to bring it to council next time and say something like, such as pools, fences, decks,
Patios.
that would be fine with me. If you choose not to, that's fine also. But at this time, I move to approve.
To initiate, is there a second? Second by Councilmember Wilsey. Questions or discussion? Should I call the roll? Or all in favor, please raise your hands. Passes 4-3. Thank you. Moving on to transportation, item number 4, consideration to accept Jones Road right-of-way agreement for a sidewalk improvement at 1390 Jones Road.
Mr. Palmer, if I could speak just briefly, I believe, I could be wrong, I've been wrong before, but I believe we've got two items, well, all of these are time-sensitive going forward, but we've got two items that I think should go rather quickly, which is a discussion about Alive in Roswell and an update on 4th of July. What I'd like to do is bump those forward because any discussion, I know we've got a hard stop, any discussion time we've got, I want to dedicate that to transportation and T-Splosh.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to item number, under administration. Item number 6, discussion of Alive in Roswell 2021.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. So back at the February Admin Committee meeting, we came to you to discuss the start of Alive in Roswell for our 2021 season. And at that time, it was determined to postpone it till the start date of July. We also stated at that time that we would come back to you before the end of April to talk about whether the July start date was valid and safe. So I'm here today to discuss that. I just wanted to give you a little brief overview of where we are right now with Alive in Roswell. As you know, it's not a permanent event. It's run internally through the Special Events Division. It's also not a budgeted event. Everything that we raise through sponsorships and through vendor dollars, and then we use that money to put on the event. So the total cost usually for all 7 is between $75,000 and $80,000. So if we scale back and do the 4 months, it's closer to $40,000 because there's a little bit of startup fees with banners and things like that. I did reach out. I've been talking to our sponsors and vendors for the last 2 years now, and I asked them about coming back in July. Out of the 13 sponsors that we originally had for our 2020 season, I heard back from 7, and 5 were that they would be able to come back in July financially and be there present. 2 were no. I think basically a lot of it is the fear of coming back a little bit and also the financial hardships that have been going on with some of the businesses and some of our sponsors. I also spoke to our vendors, and we have approximately 70 of those. I heard back from 30, 19 were 100% they'd come back in July, and 11 were no. Again, financially, some of them couldn't do it. Some of them just didn't want to be out in a crowd that large. So moving forward, we would still use the same amount of transportation. We use 3 transportation staff, 16 police, 8 recreation and parks, and then 2 from our special events division. And we would have a copy of our COVID release for everybody to sign off on. And we would post signs similar to what you see in stores before you go in about, that COVID is still out there and they take on the responsibility. So if there's any questions or comments?
Is your recommendation to start up Alive in Roswell in July?
I believe so. I wanted to hear kind of what you all
And
thought.
I would make the motion to approve.
Discussion.
I guess discussion, but a motion so we can move on to
Okay.
starting it, so. I
There's
just
a
didn't
motion
know
on the
how it
floor
would
to
go.
approve. Mayor, is there a second? Second by Councilmember Judy. Any further questions or discussion? Councilmember Spada.
Thank you. So, yeah, you mentioned that, you will make clear to understand people, okay, it's on your own risk. They're still around. If you want to come, but you're on your own risk, nothing to do with the city, no liability for the city, anything. So if this is clear, advertised, promoted and everything, I think it's very important to eliminate any potential liability or anybody who eventually blame the city for doing this. But it's up to every individual to come. If they feel comfortable or don't come, you don't have to come if you don't feel comfortable.
So we would probably run it similar to how we're doing our permanent events. We have a COVID packet that we hand out. And in that COVID packet, there's 2 sections that you sign off on that states, I understand, the liability of this, that the COVID, the pandemic is still going on. We would have them sign, we'd have our vendors and sponsors all sign off on that. And then, like I said, there's signage, and I think you often see it before you go into a business or establishment that says you're entering at your own risk. I would have a number of those made up. There are multiple entrances for Alive in Roswell, so you couldn't post at every entrance, and there's 3 different venues. But we'd have enough made that they would be throughout the event, and at the major areas where people come through. And also recommend, wearing your mask. It's not a mandate, but, we always recommend people would wear their mask when they're in that large quantity. We're looking at about 5,000 people that show up for a live.
And if I can make one more comment, this is all predicated on things continuing to move like they are. So we have to have enough time to get things going. So we're going to do that. But if the situation changes, if we end up with some bubble again or something like that, we may not. But we're assuming by July things are moving forward. So there won't be the restrictions, but we still want to put up the recommendations and the cautions, because there's no way that we can stop who's coming in and out. But we intend to move forward, hopefully as things are going.
Thank you. Real quick, because I've been asked by a lot of people in the community, and my answer, he kind of answered it a little bit, but just for clarification, people are saying, well, other towns around us are starting their events next month. Why aren't you? And what I heard you say is, hey, look, the vendors, it costs money, planning, et cetera, and July is probably the fastest we can get up and running based upon everything we need to do as a city to be ready for the event, correct?
Yes, so what takes a lot of time is the planning and the collecting of all the money, soliciting sponsors. But also, when we do this event, we have to reach out for requests for proposals and quotes for porta potties and staging and tents, all those kind of things, bands, DJs. So getting those out to the three things and getting them back and going through them also takes a long time. And then just, booking our talent that plays, the music that plays, all of that stuff takes long. The 2 months that we have right now is tight, but we've been trying to work kind of behind the scenes all along, so we'll be ready to go as soon as we can.
Good. I just want to make it clear that it's not the city doesn't want it to happen as soon as possible. It's logistics and safety and contracts and all those different type things. So, that's the reason I just wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
Second, any further questions or discussion? All in favor, please raise your hands. And it is
Thank you.
Recreation and Parks, number 7, update on 4th of July celebration. Mr. Leatherman.
Actually, he put Rusty up here.
Rusty, how are you?
Good morning, how are y'all? Basically, like Chris said, in February, we came to you with an update, basically for July 4th as well. As everything continues to progress, we're looking at moving forward and doing our July 4th event. Keep in mind the event, we moved from Roswell High School because of Fulton County policies, and we're going to have it at Roswell Area Park. So we have a lot of information that's got to go out about this going off. So as we continue to move forward, of course, our signage with the pandemic and all that, social distancing will go along with that. The key would be, where's everybody going to park? How are they going to get into the park? How are we going to get in and out and actually close down the park to traffic that's happening there? We can park about 500 cars in the park. I have a meeting with police and fire this morning, so we're going over logistics and working forward, but I wanted to bring it back to you guys and let y'all know that we're moving forward with the 4th of July. Any questions? Yeah. Any questions? Go.
Thank you. Just, and I know you probably have already thought about it, but we could offer shuttle service, parking at City Hall and just shuttle people, to the park and back.
The big thing would be trying to figure out if we do a shuttle service, where are we dropping them? Because you're going to have to walk in, because eventually those parking lots are going to fill up pretty quick. And so if fireworks are at 9:30 and you're doing shuttles, let's say 6 or 7 coming into the entertainment, we do have to figure out that traffic pattern, how we're going to get a bus in and out if we actually come into the park, or we're going to drop at Crabapple or Roswell North. So we got to work through those logistics.
Yeah, and two logistics I'd be curious about and want to be able to publicize if you work it out with police and council and everything is one, will there be legal places on Woodstock Road or anywhere nearby that maybe aren't typically available to park? But if there'd be just, similar to even back when we did it at Sweet Apple, remember just the streets, the streets kind of covered in cars. That's one thing. And I believe Councilman Judy has a golf cart. Curious if he'll be able to drive there, because you can fit more golf carts than you can cars. So not sure if that will be legal or not. But But just some things to consider just to make it as easy as possible for as many Roswell residents to be there, park, et cetera.
Sure. I think the big thing is get the communication out to
Yeah.
the folks that can walk in, the surrounding areas, get them to walk in. We're going to try to create signage where if folks are parking on the curbs, that it's only on one side, and please remember, and we're going to try to help police and fire to monitor that situation throughout the day as we continue to fill up.
Thank you.
I'd like to say thank you. I know that you all know what you're doing. You know how to put events on. You really don't need our instruction on that. So I have full confidence in you that you can pull off this event. I appreciate it. And by the way, Councilmember Palermo, golf carts are not legal on Woodstock Road. So thank you all very much. I know you're doing a great job. I have complete confidence in you that, like I said, you'll pull this off. Do you need a motion?
I don't think so, do we? No.
Thank you, Trustee.
Thank you.
Back to transportation, item number 4, consideration to accept Jones Road right-of-way agreement for a sidewalk improvement at 1390 Jones Road. Mr. Del Ross.
I've got it.
Good morning, everyone. I'll try to be brief. A new single-family home is being built on Jones Road. The address is 1390. This is a 19-acre piece of property, one home. Based on code, we have a sidewalk requirement, and based on the zoning, which is RS 87, the applicant is able to pay fee in lieu of constructing. They have elected to pay that fee. Also, as part of the code, when we accept fee, we are required to review whether a right-of-way donation will be required to construct the sidewalk in the future. That has resulted in your packet, page 29. There is a description of a right-of-way dedication of approximately 530 feet by approximately 5 feet. That's 0.06 acres for a 19-acre piece of property. We recommend approval. We will be forwarding this to Mayor and Council. Any questions?
Approved by Councilmember Palermo. Is there a second? Second by Councilmember Judy. Any questions or comments? All in favor, please raise your hands. Unanimous. Thanks. Moving on to item number 5, discussion of T-Splost renewal and project list. Mr. Ralph.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. So on this one, we'll take questions as we go. So you have the slides in your packet, so you can ask the questions when the relevant slide comes up, so at least you know what's coming up. So some background here. So we are coming towards the end of the 5-year T-Splost sales tax collection. And for uninterrupted collection beyond March 2022, voters must approve the T-Splost renewal referendum at the November election this year. So Fulton County reached out to all cities within the county a few months ago to start the process. And the county is moving forward since the majority of the cities agreed to do so. So we conducted an online survey in Roswell back in February to get public's input on 3 project categories and any specific projects they wanted to see get funded by the potential T-Splost revenue in the next 5 years. So staff developed a master list with the projects, and we had over 70 projects on that list. So we created that list using the public survey input we got, the adopted transportation plans such as Transportation Master Plan, Bike Ped Master Plan, the North Fulton Comprehensive Transportation Plan, and some staff recommendations. So all projects that made it on the big list, the big master list, are good projects. And sooner or later, we would want to construct those projects. But there's only so much funding, there's only so much projected revenue as part of this effort. So you have to cut down the number of projects on the list significantly. So there will be other future opportunities to build the projects that don't make it on the final list for T-Splost. So staff presented to you the master project list divided into 3 sub-lists at March committee. And your guidance at March committee was to submit the list so you could score your priorities for all the listed projects. So we appreciate you taking the time to complete the project scoring and submit them back to staff in a timely manner for us to prepare the committee item for today. So the presentation today, it includes, the project list with the city council score average, and staff is recommending some exceptions to the city council scoring. And we need to clarify certain things based on some of the comments that some of you made on the project list. And then there are some new and modified requests. So our goal for today, with your help, is to try to finalize a financially constrained draft project list so staff can begin public outreach efforts on the proposed project list to receive public input in the next couple of weeks. Within the next couple of weeks will be the only opportunity for public to provide input other than the city council meeting before we approve the project list for the referendum. Can you please continue? Oh, Dave is doing that. Thank you. So looking at the projected funding for Roswell based on city's population, the Tier 1 revenue could be around $71.1 million based on Fulton County estimates. So staff is recommending following 2 items for the successful program delivery, and these are both common industry practice for such large programs. So the first one is a $5 million for program management and additional staffing, and these items would be T-SPLOST funded. And when we talk about positions, these positions could be full-time and or part-time positions. They would be temporary positions, not permanent, so they could go away when we don't need them or when the T-SPLOST funding runs out. So before we hire any of this help, we will have to get council's approval, so you will see and get to hear the full justification before we are able to move forward with any of these. So we are not going to hire additional positions on day 1, and we'll only add positions as needed. And both of these items are very important for an efficient and timely delivery of the program. So the second one is $5 million for the T-SPLOST 1 projects contingency in case we need it. And we recently made you aware at a committee meeting about the possible funding shortfall for the Big Creek Parkway Phase 2 project. And there may be other needs we don't know as of yet. So for the remaining $61.1 million, here is a funding breakdown between the 3 categories of projects based on the March public survey question on how important each project category was for the public. So we added the most important and more important categories out of the public marking. So the public preference per the survey is to spend about 23% of the intersection on 23% of the money on intersection improvements, 42% on bike ped projects, and 35% on roads, bridges, corridors, and other category projects. So the amounts you see on the screen reflect these percentages with one exception. And that exception is that we reallocated approximately $10 million from the bike ped category to the roads, bridges, and corridor category for bike ped elements within the corridor improvement projects. So such as Riverside Corridor Improvement, which will have bike ped elements within the scope. So the overall funding splits for bike ped elements within different categories of all projects is still approximately 42% as per the public preference. And that's true for now, and we got more on that to come, so I'll clarify that a little later. So this whole exercise that you are about to see was just a starting point to have a recommendation for ready for your consideration today. And the amounts or the percentages that you see can be adjusted based on your input we received today. So we also have a little disclaimer to make for the record. So all project costs shown here are rough estimates based on certain reasonable assumptions. In many instances, the projects don't have a defined scope, so some costs are very rough, and these estimates will get revised as we go through the public involvement process on individual projects when we actually start working on these projects if the referendum passes. So here is the first of the three sublists. So as scored by the mayor and council, we have the rankings listed on the column to the left of the screen. And this list is for the intersection improvement projects category. So in your ranking, just to remind you, 1 was the lowest priority and 5 was the highest priority. So we have this red line drawn here, which is where the funding target is almost reached based on the public's preference of percent split for this category. So the projects above the red line are currently proposed to be funded. And looking at the project list from the top, you see the intersection of Old Alabama Road at the Old Alabama Connector intersection that needs some help in the southbound direction. Then we have the Crabapple at Hemry Road project. That intersection desperately needs some turn lanes. Then we have the Mansell Road at Sun Valley Drive. That also needs some help in the southbound direction. And then we have Hardscrabble Road at the King Road intersection improvement by the Roswell High School. And that estimate you see there in front of it is for our roundabout, but that would depend on further analysis if roundabout is a good fit for that intersection. Then the next one is the State Road 92 and the Mountain Park Road. So GDOT recently approved that one on 2 approaches, but the southbound approach could still use some help, and that's where the future Fire Station 8 could locate, so it would help with that traffic relief as well. Then the last one above the red line is the Bowen Road at Jones Road. So that intersection has been needing some help for many years now. We are actually about to implement a short-term improvement there in the next couple of weeks. And the cost with the long-term proper fix, the cost shown here, $4.9 million, is for a roundabout. But again, you know, further analysis at a later date with public input may change that scope. So that's where the red line is drawn. That's where we almost run out of the funding target. So if you want to please note the difference between the funding target here and the total estimated cost of the projects above the red line. So the difference of the amount $13.8 million and the $13.06 million. That is the remaining amount from this list. And we'll talk about, so there's not enough money to go and grab the next project on the list. So that's why there's this remaining money, and we have recommendations for your consideration a little bit later. Gary, there's a question.
So, obviously, I have a lot of issues with a lot of things discussed. But first question that I have is, remind me, funding target, is that a county or state law, or is that just staff recommendation?
So it's not a county or a state law, and it's not a staff. Well, it is a staff recommendation, but it is really based on the public input. So as I explained at the list, at a slide prior to this one, that So the public input we got from the public in February, we didn't have any projects listed at that time. We just had project categories. So, yeah, so when I talk about a funding target, 23% of the residents said they thought intersection improvements are either most important or more important. So that 23% of the total became this $13.8 million. So
Right.
that is dictated by the public input.
And I completely get that, and I think if, without a doubt, I'm one of the people that see intersection improvements as a priority. That being said, what we have here is we have some very expensive intersection improvements that actually create a lot of issues for some residents. And so that wasn't taken into account. And I guess that goes to my bigger picture. I definitely love the thought process of you were looking at the survey from a percentage standpoint, but at the end of the day, we have to look at what are the specific property projects helping. And as I read through the results earlier this week, I felt that this, not only did it not take into account survey results from residents enough, it also didn't take into account even the scoring process from council, who's really responsible and accountable to the residents to really represent them. And my last comment I'll make, because clearly at the moment I'm certainly in opposition, and I think without a doubt we have to have a list that we get out to the and make public, because if T-Splosh does pass, then we certainly need to make sure that we're getting our share, and that requires a list, so we have to go through that. But I really feel that Roswell hasn't earned the right to really request additional tax money from residents. And a part of that goes back to the fact that in here, I see multiple examples. One was covered before, which mentioned the bridge. But I feel what we should not be doing is asking taxpayers to pay for something that we weren't able to fully cover last time we had asked them to pay a tax. So I definitely have a lot of philosophical issues with a lot here, and that'll probably be my last comment for a while. But I just want to make sure I was clear on how you defined the funding target, and understanding it was staff recommendation, not any requirement. So thank you.
Sure. So one thing I would like to clarify here, so the three sublists you are going to see today, they are now ranked based on the average of the 7 elected officials scoring. So this is ranked, this is sorted per the city council scoring. So in the intersection improvement category, the sublist for intersection improvements, the projects you see from the top, they came up high on the list based on the council score.
Within the individual list, it's ranked, but then what we see is, so for example, a score of 1.4 and a $5 million update, and that's an update that actually, if we make it, we have many residents who are all constantly complaining to us that there's too much speed and too much traffic on Jones Road, and how dangerous it is for them to get out of their driveways, out of their streets, et cetera. And basically, what we have here is, and probably for that reason, it only scored 1.4. But as we look at other slides, we're going to see the 1.4 getting $5 million allocated, with many others that ranked much higher that are not recommended by staff to be funded. So that's where I feel this was not fully taking into account not only resident feedback and surveys, but also even council, because we can't just look at one list in a vacuum. We've got to look at them all and see where are the greatest impacts and the greatest satisfiers for our taxpayers. So that's why I said I feel it's not taken into account. I agree it's ranked in the individual list, but again, those 3 lists are not in a vacuum, and we don't have enough money for everything.
Okay, so I'll just clarify one more thing. So like I said, we don't have scopes for these projects yet, and that's what gets defined once we start working on the concept, and that's where we receive public input if the T-Splosh passes and we initiate the projects.
Thank you. Thank you for putting this together. As Councilmember Palermo noted, the scoring and the dollar amounts and the other areas just don't sync up. an example is the project categories. I've had a lot of residents reaching out to me, and when they were talking about, or were asked about intersection improvements, folks along Pine Grove Road were talking about Pine Grove Road from Cobb County to Canton Street being improved. That's what they were talking about, an intersection improvement. And so when I look at the Lake Charles to Cobb County line not making the intersection improvement, or because it was in another category, not being categorized, and $5 million going on a 1.4 ranking number compared to a 4.429 ranking number, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't align with what the residents feel and need that they want. So we have to look at this in a different way. I don't think this fairly represents what the residents want.
Sure, so two things. When we say a corridor improvement project, whatever limits we define, that means any intersections along that stretch of the corridor, they get analyzed, they get picked up, they become part of the project. So when we say a corridor improvement project, it includes any and all intersections that need any kind of improvement, and that comes up again with the analysis and the public input at a later time.
I understand. Just let me add to that. So when you did the percentages and said, oh, the reason we've allocated this because 23% responded this way, I don't believe that that's accurate, because the residents were responding to other items. So your 23% allocation may or may not be accurate. That's my point.
Thank you. I'm going to add on a couple of things to what Councilmember Hall just said. First of all, I want us to be very careful with the amount of weight we put on the survey. There were 300 and some respondents, if I recall, and many of the questions were only answered by 200 and some. And so while that input is important because those folks took the time to do it, that's about 350 out of close to 100,000. And so what that really means is the responsibility rests with us, the electeds, to make those trade-offs. Giving deference to those people who thought it was really important to respond, of course, but you know, this is on us. I think what transportation has done here is tried to give us a framework to work within, and so I don't really want to argue much about the framework. What I'd like to do is what Councilmember Hall just brought up, and that is, if we don't think that Bowen Road at Jones Road intersection improvement for $4.9 million is a specifically good program, and we'd like to change that to complete all of Pine Grove, let's talk about that swap, okay? You know, from my standpoint as it relates to Pine Grove, without regard to what the residents want, that street's in bad shape, and that corridor needs significant help before somebody else gets killed on it. So I get that part, but I would like to take this as the base, and then let's say, okay, I want to swap this project for that project. I don't know that there's going to be a huge list of those things that we want to swap. And I think all that transportation is trying to do here with those percentages is give us some kind of framework, so we're not looking at a list of 70 projects. The other thing I think they're trying to do is for a referendum like this to pass, people have to, I think, visualize it in categories. And so, you know, we're going to spend X amount in this category and X amount in that category. Whether an item fits exactly in the category or not, I'm not sure is all that important. But giving it some sort of framework, I think, is all that they're trying to do. And so, you know, if the council, members of the council believe that Bowen at Jones intersection at $5 million, $4.9 million isn't a good one, and we want to substitute in the rest of Pine Grove, let's have that discussion. And so it's kind of a, you know, let's check off the ones that seem to be okay, and then make the trade-offs on the ones that we don't think are okay. But have some sort of framework here to work in based on the time frame we've got. And that could be a number of changes, but again, it's a framework to work in.
There are a couple of points that I think that we need to remember when we're discussing this. Number one, this is a single funding source. This is not our only source of funding as we move forward with transportation projects. This is a funding source. The other thing, and so there might be projects that I fully support that aren't on here, but this is one funding source. So then the other thing that I'd like to point out is, and I don't believe anyone on this council has been involved in a bond or in T-SPLOST, but what we have to do with T-SPLOST is it has to appeal to the public. If it doesn't appeal to the public won't vote for it. So I think that it's very important that we choose projects throughout the city that will get people engaged, that will that our public will support. I think that's key. And so, like I said, I'd just like everybody to remember that we're choosing projects because of their merit, but also where are those projects located, what folks are going to get out and support those projects, and also keep in mind this is a single funding source. So we will have other funding sources to move projects forward.
Thank you. Two comments I have. So Councilman Tiser's points on a direction. So I agree with the big picture thought process, and it's a productive thought process. My issue is I feel council has already somewhat done that. So when we got the lists, it was 3 lists and just looking at all the processes. And so I think what we're going to find is, and I forget, I didn't look at it this morning. I looked at it, again last night. But if we use the Bowen Road at Jones Road example, council weighed in and weighted it a 1.4 score. I'm going to guess when we go over to the Pine Grove one, I'm going to guess it has probably a much higher one. So my issue is we've already gone through this exercise, but the exercise, it wasn't taken into account. And it just seems to me like it's going to add a lot of time to just have to redo this whole exercise that we already did and emailed in. And again, with it, in seeing just a lot of the thought process and all of that, it really makes it questionable of if we should even be really advocating it. Have we earned the right to really even vote for or ask residents to vote for more taxes on this? And I know as a council we don't make a position, but my expectation is probably every individual up here will either be advocating for taxpayers to vote yes or to vote no in their individual status. And again, going to the dollar amounts, when I looked at it and compared some projects, I really question some of the dollar points, and I'm not going to use this time for that because I don't want to scrutinize some of the numbers, but there were some areas where I'm very familiar and very similar, very different, et cetera, and being very surprised to seeing very similar or very different numbers, and where it definitely makes me wonder what is the science behind how the dollar amounts were come up with.
So just a couple of thoughts. So all good comments. So project categories were created, to get the public input and again to spread the type of projects we are able to conduct, we are able to build. So that was the reason to have project categories. And having a staff recommendation is obviously at all times a good starting point. And this is all open for your consideration. If you want to move money between project categories, if you want to move projects up and down, this is just a starting point, but we have to start somewhere. This is a third committee we are having this discussion, of course, with new information, but we haven't really gotten any specific direction one way or the other. So today could be the day when we get very specific direction, because beyond today, we absolutely don't have much time. So we're going to need some very clear guidance today from the committee.
I just want to make sure I understand Councilmember Palermo has indicated that I think he's indicated he's not in favor of T-SPLOST-2 at this point. If that's wrong, it'd be nice to correct it. But I think what we need to remember is that there's almost $80 million of expected revenue to come out of this. There is no other funding source that will get $80 million. There's other funding sources through the next 5 or 6 years. If the citizens of Roswell want these things, whatever things we put forward, they need to vote yes or no. That's the whole idea here, is to put it in front of the citizens and let them say, we want this $80 million worth of stuff or we don't. And one of the things that I can tell you is that money's not going to be available at that level, right? We may come up with other funding sources, as the mayor said, of, $4, $5, $6 million, $7 million a year, but without this piece, it can't happen. And while I don't want to increase taxes on residents, if residents want to increase taxes on themselves, that's different. And that's all we're asking them to do, is to look at a list of projects and say, as a whole, this is something I choose to pay for. If you don't want to pay for it, vote no.
Thank you. So, thank you for the presentation. On one of the slides on the presentation, the funding breakdown, I don't know which number it is, this one.
This one?
Yes. No. No, the previous one. Yes. So funding breakdown, something that caught my attention, and I will need a little more information about it, is items needed for successful program delivery. Then the second line, say 5 million be allocated for T-SPLOST 1 projects contingency. So my question here, and I need some clarification about it, is this because these projects are underfunded, or because these projects are, or the remaining of the projects that they are not completed yet, are over budget? So I would like to know what this $5 million, instead of moving forward we have to put it back for T-SPLOST 1. So I would like to know more clarification on that, please.
So at a couple of committee meetings ago, we discussed going out for public input on the Big Creek Parkway Phase 2 project. So, for these large infrastructure projects, when you work with estimates, estimates are engineers' estimates for future. They're not future predictions. So yeah, costs, they go up and down. How the economy is doing, that matters. If economy is bad, you get better bids from the contractors. If the economy is good, you get higher bids. And for that Big Creek Parkway Phase 2, we'll have to go back and refresh our memories that a year or two ago, when we were talking about the Big Creek Parkway realignment, staff recommendation was to stop the project at Holcomb Bridge and Old Holcomb Bridge intersection, which was, a change from the initial scope of the project, but based on the committee's, council's guidance, was to bring the project forward all the way to Warsaw Road, which is a good thing. We see the benefit. It's a good element, but that bumped up the cost significantly of that project. So that is the funding shortfall we are talking about as of today. No other projects, as we know of today, that they're gonna go over budget, but things happen. We still have a lot of progress to make on T-SPLOST 1 project. So yeah, things could change a little, but for a large project like Big Creek Phase 2, a little change in the percent, we're talking millions of dollars. So that's what's changing. So we can either fund this T-SPLOST 1 project contingency as part of T-SPLOST 2, or you can fund it through general fund or any other source you like. But this is just an opportunity. We are making you aware that we're going to need some more money. If you don't want to fund it with T-SPLOST 2, fund it from other sources.
Then digging in more in this subject, so the funds, the estimated funds for this plot one came on target or not?
Sure, I'll have Rob Delarose answer that.
Councilmember Zapata, the projections provided by Fulton County in 2016 that we based our project list on in 2016, those revenue came in approximately $10 to $15 million under the original projections. That is why our 2016 Tier 1 list was approximately $80 million. And the Tier 1 list we are sharing with you this morning is 71.1, reflecting that reduction in revenue. It was an estimate provided by Fulton County with Georgia State in 2016, and obviously now that we have 5 years of collections, that revenue number is dialed in a lot better for 2021.
Okay, so then you said that, let me see if I understood correctly, that the estimated original funds, what actual or accurate funds is around $10 million less than we estimated before the bond passes, right?
Or before the T-Splost passed in 2016.
So we received.
So the estimate was about $80 million initially prior to 2016, but fast forward, we are 5th year into the collection and they are down. The total is anticipated about, yeah, I'm sorry, Rob, may have to make a change.
Sorry, this is complicated. The original projection from Fulton County was not the 80. The original projection was north of 90. We will be collecting approximately 80. The Tier 1 that we are recommending to you this morning, based on best practices, based on consistency across the county and all the cities, we are recommending an 85% number of the collections that is estimated by Georgia State and by Fulton County. 85% of that number gives you the 71.1, which we are recommending Tier 1 produced projects towards.
So the county is gonna wanna see, in the IGA, we're gonna have to show the projects in Tier 1 making up the 85% of the anticipated collection. And then the Tier 2 projects that we're gonna talk later, they could be between 85% and 100% collection. So if 100% is collected, then we could build the Tier 1 projects and the Tier 2 projects. If they also require a third number for Tier 3, that's 115% of the collection. So if economy was awesome and a lot of sales tax was generated and the collection was 115%, then we'll be able to build Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 projects. So we have estimated totals from Fulton County. So for the city of Roswell, based on its population, the estimated revenue for Tier 1 is $71.1 million, that's 85%, and then an estimated $12 million for Tier 2, and then an estimated $12 million for Tier 3. So all that's gonna depend on what the revenue is gonna look like over the 5 years after, if the T-Splost passes again.
Yeah. So the public have to understand these two main variables here. For a perfect storm is receiving less funds than projected and project go over budget. That will be the worst case scenario that could happen. So, I don't know if you also model this moving forward, more pessimistic scenario and more optimistic, because, if the funds are less than expected and the project go over budget, then that is a big problem.
Yeah, well, and say the revenue is at 90%, okay? And the Tier 1 projects, they were under budget. Then the remaining 5% could go towards funding the discrepancy in the Tier 1 projects, or you could talk about some Tier 2 projects. Either way is fine, but I guess we are years away from having that conversation.
Thank you.
I just want to interject. We have a scheduled public meeting from 10 o'clock, I think until 3. It's now about 10:15. Are you looking action today? Are you just discussion?
So, no, actually, we were hoping to get the council's, input, specific input on what projects out of the 70 they would want us to go out to public with. What we want to do is we want to merge the three lists now, but we can't put 70 projects in front of public and ask them to provide us input. So the hope was to, shrink the list. And if you accept all the staff recommendations, we'd have about 24 projects on the list. And we'll merge the three lists with total 24 projects. We can ask the public what do they think about the list overall, not necessarily specifically about individual projects. But I guess the point for today was for you to tell us which of the 24 projects recommended by staff, and they are coming from, from your scoring and public input and some staff recommendations. So which of those would you want to swap between other projects that are in a different list or at the bottom of the list? The hope was to get whatever input you guys want to provide and have a financially constrained list today. So that's going to take some time.
It sounds like.
Well, Mohammed, what's the drop dead date that we have to make this decision by? Is it today?
So the point is, at May committee, you would want to approve a financially constrained project list totaling about $71 million. So you could approve it formally at the June 14th City Council meeting. We'll have the IGA from Fulton County in parallel. We hope to get that IGA at the May committee if we get it in time, and if not, we just bring it directly to June 14th Mayor and Council meeting, because that's the absolute deadline. But the point is, if we could get some direction, today to kind of somehow come up with a list that has less than 70 projects. It's too many projects, and that's why, this item is so long and confusing. If you want us to, just merge the three lists today, have all 70 projects on it, rank it by the council scoring, and start going down the list wherever the 61.1 million gets us, we get there, and that's the list. We can bring it out to the public if you like. That's a shortcut to where you want to go. But then please remember, then the bike ped category, bike ped projects may not get the 42% that the public wanted. The intersection improvements may not get the 23% of the funding that the public wanted. So it's all, open, and just looking for your guidance.
Well, I'd like to suggest, because I'm hearing today, which I'm kind of shocked about, that this council is, number one, not in agreement on a T+2, and number two, not in agreement with the way council has ranked them or the public has ranked these projects. So, and I understand your frustration. I'm a little frustrated myself. But what I'd suggest that we do, because we are not going to resolve this today. So I would suggest that we have a work session, and it's like I said before, this is where elected officials are earning their keep, is to get these things done. So I would suggest we have a work session and commit as much time as we need to that. Today, there are just time constraints, and I don't think that we can do anything that that we can justify to the public today in this short time period. So what I'd like to do is set up work session.
And I think that's a great idea. For that work session, again, I think my issue is council did already provide their guidance and their perspective. I believe it was ignored because we have projects recommended that had scores of 1.4. We had some things recommended that weren't even on, that it sounds like weren't even on the list. So what I think we should be doing is, now that council has gone through everything, they've provided all of their scorings, put that together, and then have a separate list, so we see the full ranking of here's mayor and council's feedback, And then separately, here's some items that were not even on the list, because an example is the $5 million contingency, whatever it was. That's something that was not on the list, but that's $5 million that you're allocating. So that'd be something separate. And again, let's not start from scratch. If you asked for our feedback, you got it. Let's actually use that as a starting point, because this staff recommendation, I feel, again, is ignoring that. I think this mayor and council does realize and did look at the survey feedback, which I think should be a factor, but obviously we need to really think bigger and make sure that we are taking into account, all over the city and all those aspects. But again, what I saw today was ignoring our feedback, in which case, why are we reinventing the wheel and just starting from scratch again?
So I would like to clarify that. So about 90% of the council scoring, who you see, recommended by staff today. There's a lot of things that the general public does not see as needs, like some must-pay bills in the next 5 years. There's some bridge replacement projects. The public may not see them as.
Look at the screen, 1.4. So this was a priority that knocked off other priorities that might have had a much bigger score. I actually think this council probably scored bridge priorities pretty high. And if that's not the case, in that work session, let's discuss it. But I trust that this mayor and council absolutely looked at the importance of bridge replacements, a lot of things, big picture, in addition to the survey results. So I'm just looking at this screen. This screen right here tells me it all. And so that's my issue.
Sure. So let me just clarify one thing. So I was not done with this slide, and if you read at the bottom, it talks about staff is recommending some exceptions to the council ranking. You have not heard my justification yet on why we are making those or recommending those exceptions. So
I support the exceptions. I'm actually comparing the 1.4 to things we have on. I want to look for what are the things that have really high rankings from all of council. That's what I'm curious about. So yeah, 1.4 compared to 1.5 compared to 2, I'm not worried about that. I'm not thinking about that. What I'm wondering is 1.4 was clearly something that was low. It's low for a specific reason, that this would actually create a lot of backlash, yet that was on there, and higher ranked things that would not create any backlash were excluded by staff. So that's why I'm saying let's put it all together. I'm actually fine with the exceptions. If you want to have a ranking and then show here are the exceptions, even though this one's a 2, here's your issues with it, I have no issue with that. It's just I didn't see that on the other ones, in which case I feel how helpful was even our ranking process?
Please. Please, just one important comment, please. I want to make sure that while we're accusing staff of not following our direction, we were given 3 lists, List A, List B, and List C. I believe it was always the intent that we would be ranking in the 3 categories. And so to put the list together as a total list and look at all the ranking is very nice, but I think staff did exactly what we were expected to have them do, and that was look at the rankings inside each of the 3 lists. Otherwise, we would not have gotten 3 lists. Motion to adjourn.
On the floor, is there a second? Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, thanks. So you mentioned a few minutes ago a list of 24 items. Could you please show us so we make sure that we're talking about the same 24?
So there is.
I heard something 24. I don't know if it's.
Yeah. Okay. So total master list had 70 projects, and if you approve all staff recommendations, meaning there is 3 lists up on the slides. And if you add the number of projects that are above the red lines on the 3 slides, and there's another list of 7 projects, I believe, that are additional recommendations from staff, like the must-pay bills. If you add those 4 categories, so projects above the red lines on 3 lists, and a separate list that is on a slide later on, if you add the number of projects, that's the 24 projects. So what I was saying is if you accepted all staff exceptions, all staff recommendations, the number of projects would be 24, and they add up to, I believe, the 71.1, including the program management, the staffing, the T+1 contingency, and everything. So staff is recommending to you today a list, a financially constrained list, basically.
24. Is there any way you can show on the screen so at least I'm sure with 24 lists are you talking about so I can look at this?
We figured it out.
Well, but I
It's a
want,
little bit.
but I want
So
one in the screen
if,
for the people
so
to know.
it's 3 and 3, 6 projects here on top of the red line. So these 6 projects. There is 5 projects here above the line, so plus 6 plus 5. And then there is 7 projects here. So you add that to the number. And if you also accept these bullets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 projects, if you add all these, that makes up the 24 projects and a financially constrained list to take you to $71 million. So this was the staff recommendation to get to a financially constrained list.
So any suggestion I can make is for the next meeting, you can condensate and put all these pieces of the puzzle together in one list, so it's much easier to visualize than jumping, from a slide to slide. That would be helpful. If you want us to focus on 24, that would be good and helpful, at least for me, to have in one page all of them instead of adding here and there, and that would be more clear.
I mean, we could
But,
do
it's
that.
a suggestion. It's up to you. If you don't want, that's fine too.
So I want to take any suggestions and any comments very seriously, and I respect that. But the point is, you got to give us direction for us to get to that point. If you want to today eliminate some of the projects, say anything that got ranked less than 2, eliminate that. You got to give us some guidance. Otherwise, we'll keep going back and forth with this gigantic list of 70 projects. So I haven't heard any specific guidance on what to do at this future work session.
And I don't think you're going to get that today because you're hearing from individual council members that cannot direct you. The only folks that can direct you are this council as a whole. What I'd suggest you do is come back with this presentation to a work session, but then also you've already got it, this isn't any extra work. You've already got the list on how we rank them. That list, this presentation, and we'll hash it out in a work session.
That's good. We can work with that. Thank you.
So motion to adjourn in a second. All in favor, please raise your hands. Passes. It carries. So we can adjourn.